Hi, this time I am going to review the Dragonlance Heroes of the Lands Book 1, The Legend of Huma. As you can see, this is the Spanish version. There is a story behind that. Many of you know that I am Mexican. So in this video, I am going to talk about the book without spoilers, not spoiling anything related to the plotline, so that you can still enjoy the surprises. But I am also going to share some early memories of my life as a geek here in Mexico. This video could be considered somewhat of a follow-up to my Drakkhen recommendation video. I'm going to put the link in the description below. Watch that video first if you need a bit more context when it comes to some situations that I'm going to talk about in this video. Okay. Well, when I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons about 3 decades ago, well, almost 3 decades ago, time flies, time truly flies. So, okay, when I first started playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, sometimes when I read through the Dragon magazine, I saw these ads of Dragonlance, books related to Dragonlance, that is novels, things related to the adventure modules, etc. So I was always quite curious. Nowadays, it's very easy to get into role-playing games and specific settings from any time. But back then, it almost felt like a guild or secret society sort of thing, especially here in Mexico. You didn't know how to get started with several things related to RPGs. So I didn't really understand how I could do it, because many of you know that is everyone who has lived, has had their younger years as a geek a few decades back. You know that in current times it's just very easy to use the internet to get anything that you like. Anything that you want to purchase, it's just a few clicks away. And the videos, the websites that will tell you how to play something, how to get into the lore of anything, it's just so easy to get into it. But back then, it was truly like a quest in itself. So at the time, I didn't have plans to go to the USA to purchase some Dragonlance related stuff. And the comic book conventions were quite scarce. Only in a few places in the entirety of Mexico, there were a few conventions, but they weren't very good. A few of them in Mexico City, those were okay by the time, considering the circumstances. But if you lived in somewhat of a smaller place, and I was living in such a place at that time, it was very difficult for you to get some RPG related stuff or anything related to fantasy. And there were other difficulties as well. Like I mentioned in my Dragon video, sometimes there were no hobby stores or specialized centers to purchase stuff, to talk with other players. So there was no RPG community. But either way, you still tried your best to get into those events, even though they were far from being acceptable. You still wanted to know the next big thing, so to speak. And around that time, there was going to be this sort of convention. There was going to be video games, Magic the Gathering, and some things related to role-playing games. You never knew what you will find in those places. Sometimes they focused completely on anime. Other times they focused completely on manga and video games. So it was almost like a gamble. Even if the advertisement said something like, oh, you're going to find this in the convention, they would lie. They would just say that there was going to be this or that, so that people would pay and enter. There was no way to get your money back. things were quite shady. In some places, they are still quite shady, but it wasn't a very good or honorable way of handling things. And during that time, my group had already fragmented because of what I mentioned of the Christian panic. I talk a bit more about that in the Dragon video, because it's not the satanic panic, it's the Christian panic. Like I said, satanics were doing their own less than desirable things, but the ones who started everything that, oh, role-playing games are from the devil and you're a cultist if you play Dungeons and Dragons, etc., etc., were the Christians. So, like I said, my group was fragmented. I was still hopeful of putting a group back together, finding some people that were not as indoctrinated. And I heard about this convention, and I thought, well, maybe I can meet some players there. Maybe I can obtain something related to Dragonlance, anything, to get into the setting, because it got me really curious. So I decided to go to this convention. It was in a somewhat dangerous area. It was going to be, what would you say, hosted, or it was going to happen in like a small convention room, really small place. I don't think it was a convention room at all. It was like some small hallway in the Holiday Inn, and it was somewhat of a risk, depending on the place. Here in Mexico and at that time, and even in present times, depending on the area, there are some places where there are sometimes fights between narcos and cartels and gangs and law enforcement, corrupt law enforcement most of the time. So when you were standing in line outside of those places, and this convention, actually you had to stand in line just at the front of a back door, you always had like a bit of worry that there was going to be what they call them, the drive-by shooting, or maybe you could get mugged or something, because the people standing in line were also like, they call like cholos and pandilleros, gangsta type of people. But either way, I was desperate for tabletop role-playing games, and I went alone. I was standing in line. I was somewhat nervous because I was surrounded by these people, and sometimes you can notice when they are going to target someone to mug you or whatever. No, they kind of like very subtly, very as smoothly as they can, they start to nod or look in your direction somewhat, and they start talking and whispering. So you have to be really careful. Luckily, I'm pretty tall. I am currently, I don't know how it is converted to feet, what it's 1 meter and 89 centimeters. You do the conversion, I'm not exactly sure. But my height almost always presented a bit of doubt or hesitation on the part of the muggers. Not all the time. In fact, I'm going to talk about a case of where I had to fight a bit concerning bullying. So either way, I got in line. I was standing there and I was like, oh, I want those guys to open the door so that we get inside the building and where it's somewhat safe. And they opened like 30 minutes late. We went inside and there was this very narrow hallway, and all of the tables with the different products and game related items were just right there. You had to like move as if you were moving in a very tight corridor. You were basically with your back against the wall, and there were the tables with the merchandise over here, and you kind of like had to look downwards towards your waist level to see if you found something to your liking. I think it was actually quite difficult for the vendors keeping people from stealing some stuff, because things were quite close to their pockets, and sometimes they wore those, they call them like those kangaroo bags, like cangureras, they call here in Mexico, they call them like that. And so it was somewhat easy to grab something and put it inside. So I think it was very difficult considering the space for the vendors. And there were a lot of pirate or bootleg stuff. many things that were not original concerning video games, anime, manga. And I was looking through all of that. You only had like 30 or 40% things that were original. They had a lot of um, bootleg DVDs and videos and all of that. But then I saw this book and I immediately knew that this was the real deal. It is official. So I immediately grabbed it. And it was somewhat, well, at the time I wasn't carrying too much money. I think it was about the equivalent of $7, more or less. It was some time ago, like I said, it's difficult to remember the exact amount, but I think it was about $7. So I purchased it immediately. I think I also purchased a couple of decks from Magic. So I went outside, and luckily, just outside of the convention, there was this group. It was a very strange group because imagine RPG geeks that want to become like bullies or want to go into that gangsta sort of vibe. So it was somewhat comical, although when you consider all the bad things that they do, then it started to be less funny and more worrisome. But the comical thing is that what would be the leader was this little mousy guy. He almost looked like a human mouse. Imagine a really pale guy with huge ears, huge frontal teeth, and like those tiny little mouse eyes. And he was like the boss. It almost looked like a cartoon situation. He was like the boss, and he was surrounded by these guys. One of them was wannabe gangsta. The other one was supposed to be like the muscle of the group. I will get into that in a few moments. But he wasn't really strong. He was just like very dumb. Someone who really wanted to fit in and didn't care about who he would damage to fit into the group. At that time, there was this other guy, somewhat like a fat guy. He basically he was always doing drugs, always like with in a weird vibe. His attitude was quite unpredictable, and they were standing there, and I thought those guys are going to look for trouble. But so they saw me, and the mousy guy saw my book of Dragonlance, and he was like, because he had this really annoying way of talking, kind of like he always talks like this, like he that noise. So he was like, "Oh, what you got there? Is that Dragonlance book?" And I was like, "Yeah," because I've never got into Dragonlance. I wanted to know about the lore, the stories, trying to be like polite, right? And he was like, "Shoo, shoo, 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 shoo. You'll never understand Dragonlance. You need to read the original trilogy. You just wasted your money. You're not going to understand anything." So always trying to like put down and make others feel bad about it. But I thought maybe I can still figure out some things, even though I haven't read the original trilogy. And this is actually one of the best ways to get into Dragonlance, because the Legend of Huma happens just before the more famous books of the Dragonlance. This is part of the mythology, the history of Dragonlance. Now, before we move forward, because I think that was a somewhat exciting way of handling things, considering the attacks from this group. So, like I mentioned, that group were kind of they were bullies. But like I said, the funny thing is that they were into role-playing games and video games, but they were always acting like bullies. There was this other member. He was, I think you consider him a bit of a puppet master behind the group. Because even though you had this guy like constantly talking like this, I did notice that he was sometimes pulling the strings. And this guy really had it out for me. And he was actually the son of a priest. Yes, priests, Catholic priests do have children, as much as they want to hide it. So if you got into trouble with him, you're basically getting in trouble with the Christian mafia. So he was almost a bit untouchable. Not exactly after several events that I won't get into, but at that time, you didn't want to mess with that guy because of the things that he could do without punishment. So that guy, I don't know why exactly he was targeting me. But I remember this time where he and another other two guys. Back then, maybe some younger viewers do not remember that time where you actually. I don't know if they still do that at school, but you usually had to create those presentations, kind of like not exactly show and tell, but you had to take your big piece of paper. How do you call it in English? Like just like a huge piece of paper, like cartulina, you call it in Spanish, and you like wrote things there and pasted some images, placed some things to express something related to a subject of something that you were studying in school. And I had just gone out of class with that, and they basically attacked me at the same time, and they took my presentation and they ripped it to shreds. But luckily, I had already presented that, so it was more like a bit of an insult, but I still had my passing grade. School is the worst place, so more people should go the homeschooling route, in my opinion. So after that, I think they thought that it was going to be easier and easier to attack me. And I was in an erroneous mindset because of religion and society, that you shouldn't fight, that you shouldn't do this and that. And the school itself pretty much encouraged this, because if you were getting attacked, they did nothing. And when you started to fight back, there the teacher or someone else arrived and what's going on here? Don't fight. And that's when they stopped you from hitting the other person. So it was after that moment that they thought that they could do even worse things. And I think there was that during that day where they decided to attack me. I just about had it. I had a terrible day in many different areas of my life, and I was eating my shaved ice. We call them raspado in Spanish, and a bag of chips, which are junk food. Terrible, don't eat those things. They have really toxic substances. So I was eating that during lunch break, and they arrived, and this guy that I told you that had that leverage, the little guy that looked like a mouse, like wasn't there, but this other guy, the priest's son, he basically manipulated or pushed the one that I told you, like he was one of the like the muscle of the group, to attack me. So he basically came over to me and he just knocked my bag of chips out of my hand. And back then I didn't know anything about martial arts, but you really have to trust your instinct sometimes. So I got really angry. So I told him, he was insulting me, and I told him something like, what? I couldn't hear you. And he got a bit close, and then I took my shaved ice and threw it into his face. And then I grabbed him from the collar and smashed my head into his face. And then when we started to fight, he wasn't really good at fighting, even though I knew nothing about fighting either. He just kept coming at me, and he had his face completely exposed. So I kept punching him until he was all swollen up. And I just kept saying, you need to relax, you need to relax. Oh, calm down, calm down. While I was hitting him. So he eventually, he noticed that he was going to perhaps lose some teeth in the fight. He was like, okay. And then he went to the bathroom and he started to cry. So it wasn't, we were like 15, 16 years old, 14, around that time. So it was really puzzling. Perhaps he changed his ways after that beating, who knows? I lost contact with that group many years back. But yes, it was somewhat of an exciting moment. Maybe because I took revenge or enacted justice because of all the things that they had been doing to me. And I will tell you how that plays into my reading, my experience of the Legend of Huma. Because no matter what people say, getting revenge, getting even, carrying out justice, it's probably one of the most satisfying things that you can experience in your life. You never feel empty. Don't listen to all of that crap that, oh, it's so empty and so sad. No, it feels so great. So when I started to read The Legend of Huma, I was kind of like in that right mindset of being a paladin and fighting for what was right. In that case, I was defending myself, and hopefully, at the very least, that guy, that bully, would think once or twice before attacking someone. Who knows? So, The Legend of Huma, after all of that, finally got to the book. This book is a sort of underdog story. In other stories of the Dragonlance, they always represent Huma, the main character, as a sort of ideal, invincible paladin. He could do no wrong, he was so amazing. The book actually starts giving you like the opinions of a historian in the setting of Dragonlance in the world of Kryn, telling you how he managed to compile the real story of Huma, the more human side of Huma, not presented as this invincible superhero, but as someone who was trying to do good with what he had. So, looking at it like that, I think Huma perhaps got me into my love of paladins. I mentioned in my other videos that I have played a lot of paladins throughout my life. I am currently playing more berserkers in different video games, role-playing games, but sometimes I return to the paladin archetype. So anything related to Huma, even though they are not specifically paladins, you could consider them like that. King Arthur, El Cid Campeador, you know, the famous knight from Spain. His poems are really amazing. If you read poems from El Cid, the way they describe the battles where he stabs his enemies and blood starts to pour down his forearm, they are very realistic. You really see how those things could be happening. So Huma kind of like further cemented my love of being a knight, and how sometimes knights cannot be perfect. Even paladins, they have their imperfections. Although the Dragonlance is an official setting of Dungeons and Dragons, you can clearly see that even being a paladin, Huma was still somewhat flawed. He was always in the right mindset of virtue, righteousness, in my opinion, but he was far from perfect. So you see Huma as this very young knight of Solamnia. And if you get a bit annoyed, or you find it a bit like exasperating when a main character starts really weak, maybe this is not the book for you, because Huma, first level paladin, obviously, he has some really a lot of moments of weakness, specifically strategic, tactical, and physical weakness. He's such an eager knight trying to prove himself that he reminds me a bit of Parn. If you haven't seen my video featuring the Record of Lodoss War, probably one of the best anime that reminds you of Dungeons and Dragons, please check it out. He's basically like Parn. He is this knight that sometimes bites off some more than he can chew, and he gets knocked out a few times throughout the story. But through luck or just sheer willpower, eventually he does become better. They are at that moment in the Dragonlance setting where there is this evil wizard, Galandrakos. I don't know if his name is different in English, but in the Spanish book, it's Galandrakos. And it almost seems like almost impossible. How is Huma, such a rookie knight, rookie paladin, going to face off against that threat? So you see Huma participating in different battles, picking himself up after he got knocked out during the fight. But then he meets some very interesting characters. His first ally, Kaz the Minotaur, one of the coolest characters that I have read in fantasy fiction. He becomes like kind of like his sidekick. I'm sure Kaz would find it repulsive for someone to think of him like Huma's sidekick, but he's basically honor bound to Huma. So Kaz and Huma are fighting all of these different monsters and enemies, and Huma even meets some old friends along the way. Well, he's constantly interacting with members of the Order of the Knights of Solamnia. You can see how he looks up to his superiors, his interactions and relationship with them. But he also has this friend, a very powerful sorcerer by the name of, how would you say it in English? Well, it's, in Spanish it's Magius, so I guess it's Magius. Magius. Let's say he's Magius. So Magius, he's a very powerful wizard, but after so many years being apart, because he has to study in that tower of wizardry in the setting of Dragonlance, where many other famous wizards have studied, like Fistandantilus and Raislin. So Magius, when he gets back into contact or in touch with Huma, Huma doesn't know if he can entirely trust Magius or how much he has changed through his ordeal. As Huma keeps on fighting, he improves his tactical and strategic reasoning. He improves in sword fighting. And almost by chance, he even becomes friend with a dragon. That dragon is Huma's famous silver dragon. So he starts to become a mid-level to high-level paladin in Dungeons and Dragons terms. He's going to face off against different monsters and enemies. He's going to struggle almost halfway through the book, but by the end, he's so powerful, to be honest. He can take on very difficult to defeat foes. You can see how his stats and abilities and powers as a paladin grow with him. He's going to, not to avoid spoilers, he's really going to fight an incredibly powerful enemy. I really like the different environments because it feels like you are part of a military campaign in that fantasy setting. It feels like you are traveling with Huma. They are taking stops in this place and that place. Huma eventually is going to find romance. He's going to be interacting with beings, natural, unnatural, and normal people as well. Later on, he starts to become this leader. He starts to amass this group to face off against Galandrakos and his army of dragon-mounted knights. And it is here where they introduce the Dragonlances, those weapons that are capable of even hurting the gods themselves. But the dragons mostly, the dragons are a great threat in the setting of Dragonlance. So if you love aerial battles, let me see if I can show this to you with focus and without the video quality going down. You can see here, this is one of the bad guys. There are going to be this aerial jousting sort of combat or war. Really exciting, with dragons also using their breath weapons. And this is classic D&D, or Dungeons and Dragons, specifically Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. There isn't too much in terms of dungeon crawling. It's more of a fantasy military campaign book. There are some adventure sites, but most of the action is going to be focused on moving from place to place, planning the battles, having these sort of like moments in camp when Huma and others talk with each other. There are going to be some plot twists along the way. What I really admire of Huma, despite his recklessness and his weakness at times, being a rookie paladin, is that he is constantly suffering psychological and emotional blows. Something happens to this person that Huma was close to. This is a huge spoiler and one of the most amazing moments in the book. There is going to be a radical change in how Huma interacts with one of his allies. And some of those changes are just surprising. Some of them are quite tragic. And you really admire how Huma takes all of that and he's still able to fight. Something terrible happens and he's still able to get on top of his dragon and use his Dragonlance and let's go. Maybe I'm suffering this breakdown or sadness, depression, anything. Huma, just let's keep going. That is minor compared to the threat that the world is suffering. So he's an incredible paladin, an incredible example. By the end of the book, he's such an amazing hero when compared to how he started. When it comes to the climax, it's one of those climaxes where you keep thinking back to those moments, to some key moments, and you feel a bit like they took your breath away. You're kind of like, I can't believe that happened, or could things have proceeded differently? What was Huma thinking during that moment? What was he experiencing? There are some funny moments, but there's also great melancholy. And those that have read the other Dragonlance books, they always hear about the tomb of Huma, and here was Huma buried, and if you had because at that time I didn't know anything about that, I couldn't fully grasp the scope of everything that was going on. But later on, when I became more knowledgeable about Dragonlance, and I still have many things to explore concerning the setting, it all just meshes up together in a huge emotional bomb. I am actually thinking of reading this book again. It's one of my favorite fantasy books. Yes, it's such an amazing book, especially if you like to play as paladins or knights, perhaps even cavaliers. Here it's all about being a paladin. You also, I think, I'm not exactly sure, but I think this is the first time that they introduced that oath of the Knights of Solamnia. How was it? Because I think it's a language specific to this book. It was Est Solaris Oth Mythas. My honor is my life. Huma mentions this in several critical moments when he's going to do something almost suicidal, and he explains that. Or when he's trying to just uphold an ideal. So very admirable, very touching. You really see the change of the story with almost some happy-go-lucky moments early on, and then you get to the middle of the story and everything is just happening so fast, and by the end you see that things cannot, they're going to end in cataclysmic ways. It really feels like a battle between gods by the end. So my highest recommendation, definitely read the Legend of Huma. I would have preferred it to read it in English. I like to read books in the original language. That is, if something was written in Spanish, I prefer to read it in Spanish, like El Cantar del Mío Cid, del Cid Campeador. But maybe one time I will buy it in English, who knows, but I still enjoy the Spanish version a lot. It never felt like something was lost in translation. Definitely get this book. Now, when it comes to flaws, perhaps the only flaw, yeah, it's a very minor thing, it could be a nitpick, is that sometimes they introduce a lot of characters. You have this moment where you have 2 or 3 characters, that's okay, but suddenly all of these characters present themselves, and you see so many stories and backgrounds, and as the conflict goes on, it's like those characters fade a bit into the background. Even Huma, in one part of the story, when a character dies, he kind of laments that he didn't even have time to mourn the death of that character. So I think that expresses a bit that if you are someone who likes all of the characters in the book to have a very definable backstories, or even conclusion to their personal quests or whatever, you won't find much of that in this book. But everything else is just perfect, in my opinion. So definitely give this book a try. Well, thanks for watching this review and listening to my early geek memories. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know, and thank you so much to those of you that have been supporting the channel by sending DriveThruRPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information on how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and see you later.